and welcome to our weekly look inside Syria. I'm Foli Batibo. After weeks of negotiations, intense diplomacy and the threat of military action, the United Nations has finally agreed on a resolution to destroy Syria's chemical weapons. On Friday, the 15-member Security Council voted unanimously on the deal put forward by the US and Russia. The vote came after the international chemical watchdog agreed on a plan to destroy Syria's stockpile by mid-next year. The passing of this resolution breaks a 2.5-year deadlock at the UN over Syria, where at least 100,000 people have been killed since the conflict began. Our diplomatic editor James Bays has this report from UN headquarters in New York.
Just 3 weeks ago, military action in Syria seemed close.
I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now.
But for now, an entirely different outcome. A unanimous vote by all 15 Security Council members to authorize the disarmament of Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. A resolution based on the deal drawn up by the US and by Russia.
Together, the world, with a single voice, for the first time, is imposing binding obligations on the Assad regime, requiring it to get rid of weapons that have been used to devastating effect as tools of terror.
His Russian counterpart made it quite clear what this is not.
This resolution does not fall under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter and does not allow for any automatic use of coercive measures of enforcement.
There was plenty of talk about what happens after this meeting, talk again of trying to stop the war, and a new date for the much-delayed Geneva Peace Conference.
We have agreed, and it has been expressed by the Secretary General, that the aim, I don't remember exactly the wording, was mid-November.
The problem with that is that the Syrian opposition have never said they'll attend a Geneva conference, and the Syrian regime still seem to be insisting that Assad should remain president whatever happens. The Geneva conference was originally set for June. During the delay, thousands more Syrians have died. James Bays, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
And just before the vote, James Bays spoke to the Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim outside the UN headquarters. Here's some of what he had to say.
Foreign Minister, are you confident of the prospects of peace right now?
Well, it's premature to speak about it, as long as fighting going on the ground.
Do you think there could be a deal that will bring everyone to Geneva?
I hope so. I hope so.
And what about the chemical weapons resolution?
Well, we welcome it. We welcome it because we are determined to go forward in the respect of destroying the chemical weapon.
And in terms of Geneva, are you prepared to concede on the role of President Assad, that he might step down?
Nobody can speak about the role of President Assad because it is mentioned in the Constitution. So we will not violate our Constitution. His role is for the Syrian people is very important and crucial.
So will this agreement now pave the way for talks on the broader Syrian issue? To discuss this, we're joined by our three guests. In New York, Najib Ghadban, representative of the Syrian National Coalition at the United Nations. In Oklahoma in the United States, Joshua Landis, director of the Center for Middle East Studies and a professor at the University of Oklahoma. And in London, Amar Wakaf, a Syrian political activist. Gentlemen, thank you all for being on Inside Syria today. If I may start with you, Najib Ghadban. The passing of this resolution at the UN Security Council is seen as the first hopeful news on Syria in a very long time. We heard from the Syrian foreign minister who said he was optimistic about the prospects for peace. But what about the Syrian opposition? How do you view this breakthrough at the Security Council? Is it a positive development?
It can be, assuming there will in fact be follow-up on what was missing in this resolution. And that is precisely the question of accountability. Now, this resolution focuses on the question of disarming the Syrian regime of its chemical weapons arsenal. But it doesn't really address two issues. Number one, those who used chemical weapons against their population, i.e. Assad, and some of the officers are still unaccountable. The second issue, it doesn't really address the fact that most Syrians, more than 107,000, were killed by conventional weapons, all types of weapons. So it didn't address that question, which I think there was an opportunity to at least say that the regime should not be allowed to use, for instance, Air Force, Scud missiles, heavy artillery, and tanks. So those are, I think, some of the weaknesses of this resolution from our perspective.
But do you think the Syrian government is sincere about giving up its chemical weapons stockpile?
No, I don't think so. This regime believes that if you take away some of their weapons, you are weakening them. This is why we should expect, and I think we have a whole example of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that they will try to find ways, in fact, to get around it. That's why the other, I think, factor that should really lead to its implementation is to keep the credible threat of the use of force on the table.
Well, let me bring in Joshua Landis at this point. There are still a few issues to resolve, of course, Joshua, but this vote nonetheless marks a major breakthrough in the paralysis that's gripped the UN Security Council over the last two and a half years or so. But in your opinion, does it mark a turning point in the Syrian conflict itself? Do you think this could be the first step towards a broader ceasefire, perhaps?
Well, clearly it's very important for getting rid of chemical weapons. I mean, I think we have to distinguish here. President Obama is focusing only on chemical weapons. He's quite specific that he's not intending to change the balance of power on the ground or to solve the Syrian civil war. He's trying to separate those two issues and say we can uphold this traditional inhibition to use chemical weapons. And that's what he's trying to do. So all these other issues about solving the civil war are really not on. On the other hand, there's hope that the Russian-U.S. cooperation could then bring us to a Geneva down the road. It's very difficult at this point to see how Geneva could possibly get off the ground. As Najib Radban has been saying, they want Assad to go. Assad is not going to go anywhere. We just heard the foreign minister say that. He is a power on the ground. He's not going to step down, and he's going to be there, or his people are going to be there. So this is a real problem. The other problem on the ground is that so many of the militias, the people with real power in Syria, have just rejected Najib Radban's group, the opposition coalition, and said, these guys haven't delivered America, essentially is what they're saying, and we're not going to pay any attention to them. They don't represent us, and we're going to do what we want on the ground. And this is a major, major headache for U.S. policy and for the opposition coalition, because there's no unity amongst the ranks of the Syrian rebel forces in opposition.
And I do want to ask Najib Gadban about that in just a few minutes, but let me just bring in our third guest, Amar Wakaf in London. Amar, what is your view on this resolution? Do you think it's a positive step? Can this resolution, even though it's on chemical weapons, and we know that more civilians have died from conventional weapons in Syria than chemical weapons, do you think this resolution can have an impact on the fighting on the ground in Syria? Will it change the battlefield realities, if you will?
Well, it would change the balance around Syria, that's for sure. I mean, what we see, what we are seeing day after day, and what is unfolding actually is, you know, the fingerprints of a mega deal that has been struck between, you know, relevant parties, especially Russia and the US, and probably on a regional scale. Iran is being brought in the past few days as well to be included in this thing. And, you know, when you come to think of it, obviously, if one thinks about it as the Syrian government really thinking of their chemical weapons as an asset, then one would be led to believe that the Syrian government has buckled under pressure. But actually, if one thinks about it, as I am being led day after day to believe as such, that the Syrian government thinks about their chemical stockpile as a liability, then this is no less a feat than, say, for example, Lehman Brothers on the 14th of September 2008 being able not only to get rid of their toxic assets, but actually to sell them at a premium. And this is a major, you know, deal that has taken place, in my opinion, and this would stifle a lot of the effort around Syria to fund and, you know, arm the rebels on the ground. And we can see cracks, you know, easily being surfacing here at the moment between the ranks of the opposition, either the outside opposition or their supposed representatives.
But the question many are asking now
ground.
is, will Bashar al-Assad comply? Because as Joshua mentioned in the resolution, there's no mention of any punitive measures if the Assad regime were not to comply with this resolution. But can he be trusted to fully implement it, do you think?
I think the lack of punitive action or punitive words in the resolution is not necessarily to say the Syrian government will comply or not, but for this resolution specifically not to be made as an excuse for any automatic use of force. But my understanding of the situation, and it has developed throughout the past 2 weeks, is that actually this is an opportunity for the Syrian government to get rid of this liability. I was a member of a project. I worked for a project for the EU in Syria 10 years ago when the association agreement with the EU was being discussed, and at the time the issue of chemical weapons was brought during the negotiations, and it caused a little bit of a tension between the two sides, and this has become, you know, a requirement for the international community. And Syria, if they can actually sell it and get something in return, as in peace and stability, and keep their position in the region, that is, you know, a major feat.
Najib Ghadban, any
so
operation...
They would be very much interested.
Interesting indeed. Najib Ghadban, any operation to rid Syria of its chemical weapons would require the support of the Syrian opposition and the different groups that are fighting on the ground there. Would they be willing to facilitate this agreement? Would they, for instance, agree to a ceasefire to allow the weapons inspectors to do their job properly on the ground?
Yes, I think our general position is to welcome this, because let's remember, I mean, and again, people could frame this issue in so many ways as they want, but the key element here is that this regime used chemical weapons against Syrian population 14 times, and the last time when he used it and killed 1,466 people, of those 422 children, actually while the investigators were on the ground. So this is a regime has no limit, has no, you know, they're willing to go to the extreme. So from our point of view, to take that weapon from them is a positive development.
But
now,
would all the groups on the ground, because as Joshua mentioned, I'm sorry to interrupt you, as Joshua mentioned, there are divisions within the Syrian opposition. Those who are fighting inside Syria are not necessarily on the same wavelengths as the Syrian National Coalition. So would they on the ground agree to this? Yes.
I'm going to address this point.
Go ahead.
If you allow me. Two points. The first one, the chemical weapons are under the control of the regime. So if the regime is sincere, in fact, about giving up this chemical weapons arsenal, it's mostly under their control. Yes, I mean, the investigators might need to go cross-border, cross areas where the rebels might control some areas, but this is an operation, again, where the party that's concerned mostly is the regime. The second point addressed the question of this statement that came out 3 days ago. I think it was exaggerated great deal. Let me say that these three groups, the communique was signed by three major groups. One of them is Al-Nusra, and Al-Nusra never recognized the coalition. We don't recognize the Nusra, we don't work with it, and we want to distance ourselves from Al-Nusra. Then you have a second group, which is part of the SMC, the Supreme Military Command, which is affiliated with the coalition, and in fact, those groups expressed a great deal of disappointment. Disappointment which is shared by all Syrians, that the person who used chemical weapons basically, in a way, is getting away with it. And that frustration might explain, it's a message saying, you know, to the international community, if you don't work to rid this country of this criminal regime, and at the top of it Assad personally, then this country is going to radicalization. And let me be very clear here. You know what? In 6 months, if there is no political solution without Assad, and moving toward democratic transition, which is the essence of Geneva II, yes, you may not have a coalition, you may not have a SMC, you may not have moderates
and the opposition has not committed yet. Sorry to interrupt you, but the opposition is still not committed to a Geneva II conference. The hope is now that with this deal that both sides could return to the negotiating table. Under what conditions would you return to the negotiating table? Is that Bashar al-Assad step down still a precondition for negotiating?
Let me clarify this point. We made our commitment. In fact, during my delegation's visit to the UN, where we addressed 114 countries at the General Assembly, the Friends of Syria, and we had so many meetings, the Arab Ministerial meeting, bilaterals meeting, we affirmed our commitment to Geneva II with the understanding, I don't want to say precondition, the interpretation, our interpretation of Geneva before the use of chemical weapons does not leave room for Assad, because we are talking about transitional government with a mutual consent, with full executive authorities, including military, security, judiciary. So it's going there. It's not a precondition, but it's our understanding and the understanding of the majority of the world that this process does not, in fact, have a place for Assad. So that's our understanding, and we believe if you want to go and have a successful Geneva, you need international guarantees. There should be consequences after we sign anything by the international community, by the Security Council, and we are not going to go to Geneva without Arab endorsement and support.
Ammar Wakaf, I saw that you wanted to jump in there at one point.
Yeah.
First off, on the issue of Assad stepping down or not, where do you stand on that? Do you think this, what the opposition is demanding, should perhaps be considered by the Syrian government?
Well, I think, first of all, as a Syrian citizen, I would want my next president to be elected in a fair and democratic way. I mean, this is what the whole thing is all about, isn't it? So stipulating or having a precondition that this person should not run for election or should step down before the elections isn't really what a lot of Syrians would accept in a political process. And with regards to the authorities of the future government, or the government that would come out from Geneva too, I think the foreign minister earlier in the report made a very valid point. There is a sort of constitution at the moment in Syria that stipulates what the president of the republic can and cannot do. But let me go back, if I may, to one sentence that came out in the Security Council resolution. If I can quote the Security Council, and speaking about the parties that represent the Syrians in the Geneva too, I quote, "The Security Council underscores that they, the representatives, should be fully representative of the Syrian people and, second, be committed to the implementation of the Geneva Communique." Now, with the statements, successive statements that we've seen in the past few days about the armed groups on the ground disowning the coalition, and when I wanted to intervene, actually, Mr. Ghadban was saying that they do not consider Jabhat al-Nusra to be part of the revolution. Actually, when the United States about a year ago or 10 months ago classified Jabhat al-Nusra as a terrorist organization, the head of the coalition at the time, Ahmed Muaz al-Khatib, came out in public and said, no, this is part and parcel of the Syrian revolution. So who's disowning who at the moment? And it's not only the Jabhat al-Nusra.
Okay,
a lot of fighting brigades from what is known as the Free Syrian Army also have taken the same position. Apparently there are people who are smelling a cake in the oven and are, afraid a little bit that the shares, won't be included when the shares are split.
Joshua Landis, this is an issue for the Syrian opposition, this lack of cohesion, and with them being so, I guess, negative on this deal and whether or not it will work, do you think we're likely to see peace talks, broader talks on the Syrian issue very soon? Because Geneva II has been postponed time and time again. Do you think it'll happen, and will it yield to anything positive in your opinion?
I don't think it's going to be successful. The two sides are very far apart. The object of Geneva II is to get some kind of hybrid government and cooperation with a unified Syria. That's not going to happen. The rebel forces do not want to have the security forces of Syria, the Syrian army, in any way, shape, or form that they've ever existed on top of their heads for another decade. And Assad is very powerful. He's not going to step down. His security forces are not going to step down. And you asked earlier if we're on a turning point here. And in many ways, I think we are at a turning point. And we can see with Iranian diplomacy and with American, really Obama's refusal to get involved in the civil war in Syria and to turn on the spigot for more money, more arms into the Syrian civil war, that we are at a deciding point. And in many ways, the United States is trying to figure out whether the threat of Sunni extremism in Syria is more dangerous to U.S. interests than the threat of Hezbollah and Shiite power. And the Iranians have turned up this charm campaign to downplay their enmity towards Israel, downplay their enmity towards the great Satan, America, and in a sense, to try to salvage Hezbollah, the Assad government, the government in Iraq as well, which is under incredible pressure from radical Islamists in Iraq, and to try to, they're all under terrible pressure. So is Iran under sanctions. And to try to get America off Iran's back, and to, in a sense, Iran is saying to America, we can help you solve your radical Sunni problem. If you come to a rapprochement, we will lower, nuclear weapons production, or at least the development towards nuclear weapons. And so America is caught in between today because they don't know whether Assad is a worse enemy or the Syrian opposition and the threat of radicalization is a worse danger.
Najib Ghadban, on that particular point, there are many who argue that the real danger in Syria today emanates from rebels, many of whom harbor militant Islamist ambitions for Syria that could ultimately pose a threat not just to the U.S. but also to Russia and the West. So how can you guarantee to the world, to the international community, that these different groups that are fighting on the ground in Syria would be on board with any agreement, any future agreement that you reach with the Syrian government?
Well, I mean, I can't really guarantee. There is a fact today that they are extremists and they are growing in power in Syria, and most Syrians don't share that vision. This is the important thing. There is something still called moderate opposition represented by the coalition. The bulk of the Free Syrian Army, represented through the SMC, is the majority of those fighters, and the way to guarantee that there's no further radicalization is to support those moderate and to push for a political solution that, in fact, would not have Assad as part of it. The point here is, it's not really the threat of the extremists. The extremists did not kill 100,000. They did not displace 7.5 million Syrians. They did not destroy 1.2 million houses. They are still very limited. The other point I should mention about the extremists, by the way, the extremist phenomenon in Syria is connected to the regime. It was created by the brutality of the regime, and sometimes physically, some of those guys were trained to go kill Americans in Iraq, and now they're coming back to haunt the regime. From our point of view in the coalition, we want to emphasize that moderate middle force, which represents the majority of Syrians. And it's not really, should not be a choice for the world between Assad and his criminal regime and the Hezbollah and the extremists. Most Syrians are not, they don't want neither of these visions. And in fact, there is a kind of a mutual interest between these two sides to continue this conflict. That's why the international community, and I disagree with Joshua here, that the U.S. in fact has not made up its mind. You will see more support politically, militarily, from the Americans, from the Gulf countries, from European countries in the coming days and weeks.
And on that point, I mean, the Americans have said the option of military strike is not off the table. Just to you, Ammar Wakaf, on that last point of military option, do you think this is still being seen as something that the Syrian regime is worried about, or because of all the back and forth that we've seen in the last few weeks over this issue of military strike, that they don't take this threat as being credible anymore?
I think the United States needs to portray all the time that it was because of the military pressure that it put on the Syrian government, things went ahead. And in order to convey that message, left, right and center, they are always going to say that this is not going to be off the table. But what we know now, actually what we can sense, we don't know, but what we can sense very much is that there has been a major deal struck between all different parties. And I think that the Syrian government has showed enough signs for a counter-strike or a proliferation, of the struggle to, make the United States think more or twice or even thrice about the cost of any intervention. And if it wasn't for this resolute, position of the Syrian government, I don't think the current deal that we are witnessing now unfolding could have ever been reached.
Thanks to all my guests in New York, Najib Gadbian, in Oklahoma via Skype, Joshua Landis, and in London, Amar Wakaf. That's it for today. Thank you for joining us. Remember, Al Jazeera has extensive and continuing coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this program, but with our hourly news programs and, of course, online at aljazeera.com. And if you're on Twitter, you can find me on @Foliba. Thanks for watching Inside Syria. Bye for now.